This is our special interview. Recently, Naftali Bennett was sworn in as Israel's new prime minister with approval from the Knesset, the country's legislative body. So the former and longest-serving prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, not only lost his 12-year-old grip on power, but is also standing trial for alleged fraud. And so let's find out about this new coalition government, supposedly made up of several parties. Let's find out from Amos Guiora, who is professor in the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. He's going to speak on this issue. By the way, he served for 19 years in the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, as a lieutenant colonel. He's now retired and held several senior command positions, including legal advisor to the Gaza Strip and commander of the IDF School of Military Law. Hi, thanks for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes. So first of all, can you tell us about Naftali Bennett? We don't know much about him, so can you tell us about his rise?
Sure. So Prime Minister Bennett has been involved in politics for a number of years. Before coming into politics, he was in high tech. He was very successful in high tech. And after leaving high tech and before running for office, he served he was an assistant to Netanyahu when Netanyahu was prime minister. After I think a year or a year and a half, they had some kind of a falling out, which is a repeated pattern with Netanyahu. Bennett's been a member of parliament, has been a cabinet member, and is now prime minister. You were right to note that he's the prime minister of this very broad coalition comprised of 8 parties. His is not the largest party, but his was the swing party, because if he would have gone with Netanyahu, then they would have had a rotation.
Yes.
Instead, he went with Yair Lapid, who is the largest party in the coalition, and Bennett will be prime minister for 2 years, and then Lapid will be prime minister for 2 years.
Right. So in terms of this process of transition and this new coalition government, can we go over the details of how this came about? Because we already know that apparently there are 8 different parties, but from what I understand, it's from a broad spectrum in terms of political views or platforms.
Right, you are. There are 8 parties that are comprised or based on parties from the political left, parties from the political right, including Bennett's. But what is important, and something that I think needs to be noted, is that this is the first time a ruling coalition includes an Israeli Arab party. That's very important. And it's also the first time that someone who wears a kippah, yarmulke, a Jewish skull cap, Bennett, is prime minister. It is a very broad-based coalition. What brought them together, frankly, was no more Bibi, no more Netanyahu. And one hopes we'll see that the need to replace Netanyahu, which brought them together, but that the glue that will hold them together will go beyond that, and that there will be a return to serving the public, to having the public's interest as uppermost, which has not been the case in the past X years. I think it's also important to note that we've had 4 elections in 2 years, and in the complicated parliamentary politics of Israel, nobody won. So we've gone from one transition government to another transition government, which means that there has not been a state budget for the past 2 years. And I think it's safe to assume one of the first really important tests for Bennett and his coalition will be in November, when they will propose a budget. And that will be, I think, a really important step. But I think, for people of my political ilk in Israel, call it the center left, after 12 years of Netanyahu, and right, you were to note that he's on trial for fraud, corruption, bribery, the time really came for a change. And I really, I'm not naive, but I'm hopeful that this 8-party coalition will understand that their primary duty is to the public and not to the ruling party.
I see. And speaking of that public, Professor, how is the Israeli public, generally speaking, responding to this change in leadership? Is there support for this coalition government?
Well, I guess it's going to depend who you ask, right? If you ask people of my ilk, the answer will be yes.
Yes.
If you ask the Netanyahu base, which there are 120 members of the Knesset, the parliament, the Likud, which is Netanyahu's party, has 30. So I'm not good at math. That's about 25%. So I would say 25+% of the public is probably upset. And it's also important to note that unlike all Netanyahu governments, the Orthodox parties are not represented in this government. For them, this is a major blow because they are members of coalition governments for the purpose of receiving government largesse to fund primarily their schools. There's no doubt that for the Orthodox community in Israel, this is a rough stretch because, as I say, they're not in the coalition. To your question, what's the mood in Israel? People of my ilk have a sense of hope, and those on the other side, I think, would probably not feel that same positive sense that I'm feeling.
I see. Well, can we kind of foretell what do we expect in terms of the new Israeli government under Bennett? Do we have any inkling of what's going to happen?
It's an excellent question. First of all, they're going to have to figure out how to make an 8-party coalition work. 2, it's obvious that there will be, bumps and bruises along the way. Politics is all about the art of compromise. They're going to have to figure out where each other's buttons are to be pushed and not to be pushed. They're going to have to try to address a number of important issues. Obviously, the question of Iran, the Palestinian question is obviously important. But I think first and foremost, the first thing they're going to have to do is devote their energies to reestablishing what I would call good governance, that the responsibility of each minister, whatever his or her position is to focus on the ministry to better serve the public. I think there's a need to tone down the volume. We've had, primarily because of Netanyahu, terrible incitement, whether it's against the left, the media, Israeli Arabs. I think one of the great public services that Prime Minister Bennett and his coalition partners can provide to the public is a toning down of the way in which we address issues. We'll see. I think, Netanyahu for the past X years has really been focused on the delegitimization of state institutions, particularly the courts and the public prosecutors, because he himself is under indictment. And I think that for Bennett, it'll be, and his coalition partners, will be really important to end that delegitimization and to restore public trust in institutions. And again, I can't emphasize strongly enough the question of incitement. My family and I have been regular participants in the weekly rallies against Netanyahu every Saturday night, and the verbal incitement directed against us. The term of art in Israel is to be called a traitor or a left-wing traitor, which is awful. And I would really hope that will come to an end. And in that note, I would hope that the government will, I know no other way to put this to you, will be able to restore a sense of normalcy in terms of interaction between state organs and the individual. If they can accomplish that, that would be an extraordinary accomplishment. In many ways, more important at the moment than resolving the Iran question, and more important, resolving the Palestinian question.
Right. But, briefly, though, I do want to visit the Palestinian question, as you say, because, of course, we even here in Korea have covered what's been happening between Israel and the Palestinians. Of course, this 11-day, I don't even know what to call it. I don't want to call it a war, but of course there was
conflict,
a
flare-up.
Yes, in that area, of course. So what's it like right now? Because we've been hearing that Israel has launched airstrikes on the Gaza Strip after some activists had launched incendiary balloons into Israel. Tensions are up again. So can you comment on this?
So the 11-day conflict flare-up in May was utterly and totally unnecessary. It served Hamas's purposes and it served short-term Netanyahu's purposes. But at the end of the day, was not long-term effective for Netanyahu. The recent flare-up in the aftermath of what's called Flag Day March last week.
Right?
Yeah, so Hamas fires the incendiary balloons into Israel. Israel does the air raids. Hamas fires a couple more balloons. Israel does a couple more raids, and then that's it. It's almost utterly and totally predictable what they'll do, what we do, what they'll do, what they will do, and then we move on. There was nothing in any way particularly unusual. There was nothing that was not predicted. It is the repetitiveness of it is predictable. It is this, this cycle of violence. But the last few days, they said that they did what they said they would do. Israel did what it said it would do. Hamas then repeated what they said they would do, and they did. Israel repeated what they said they would do, and they did. Now we can just move on.
I see.
But
Well, I want to address this final question because people are wondering. We've been hearing that, now former Prime Minister Netanyahu, he supposedly is vowing to return to power. Do you think this is even possible?
I think that anything is possible. He is absolutely, for now, and I emphasize that for now, locked in on coming back to power. The question is, will the coalition be able to hold itself? The ball is not in his court. The ball is in the coalition's court. And I think for Netanyahu, that is a major struggle. He's also very determined to hold the Likud, his party, in lockstep. And yesterday there was a vote of no confidence, which Likud lost. But not only did he lose, but 3 members of the Likud party who are considered loyalists to Netanyahu
Sure.
did not show up for the vote, which was critical. And is so irritated, angered, polite word, Netanyahu, that I'm not making this up, at 4:00 in the morning when the vote took place, he himself personally called the members of parliament who were absentees, expressing his great anger. I would think for someone like Netanyahu, who has enjoyed unchallenged power for 12 years, this is a new experience for him. And what's going to complicate it for him is we have a commission of inquiry that will examine the incident, tragedy a couple months ago when 45 Orthodox Jews were killed at a religious ceremony.
Right.
But more troubling than that for Netanyahu is what is called the submarine affair. We could talk about that for hours. The question there is whether or not there will be a commission of inquiry, which would very much look right at Netanyahu's actions, which I believe to be illegal in terms of the sale of submarines, German submarines, to Egypt. So for Netanyahu, who's been in absolute control, unchallenged
Yes.
for 12 years, as much as he wants to come back, I think the road is challenging. Never say never, because he's an extraordinarily gifted politician. Didn't say
Right.
an extraordinarily gifted statesman. I said politician. I would like to think that won't happen, but politics never say never. Unfortunately.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much for answering our questions about what exactly is happening right now in Israel as Bennett takes the helm for 2 years. So thank you so much for answering our questions today, Professor.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Take care. Once again, this was our special interview, and we discussed what's happening in Israel as this 8-party coalition is going to hopefully have to make things happen. They're going to have to somehow compromise. And as the professor said, the ball is in the coalition's court at this time. So we'll see what happens on that front.